Hello all. This is our first narrated PowerPoint. I've broken down Tuesdays and Thursdays lectures into two short PowerPoints per each day. They're easier to record, they're easier to upload. This is a process that I've used when I taught an online class, so I think it will work well for our class as well. So I'm going to just walk through this one, and then I'll post both the just the plain PowerPoint that you can go back to without the narration, and then the one that is the movie file that you can listen to the narration. And then I'll kind of query you guys on what you want to do as far as meetings or individual meetings, that kind of thing. So I think it's important that as English majors, you have some sense of the development of English. Now we've developed a history of English class that we had for many years, but we weren't teaching for a while. And so some of you may be in that history of English class with Dr. Poole. I know I will teach that class in either next spring or the spring after, sometime soon. It is an area that we really enjoy as linguists. That as a syntactician, there's lots of changes that we see. So, but whether you're literature or creative writing or even professional writing, just to acknowledge the kinds of changes that occurred and the causes of those changes, both historically, socially, um, uh, advances in technology, is a way to also be perceptive of the changes that are going on in your day to day language. And we will get to that very quickly and look at changes that we can observe today. But as you see here, these are the major periods of English and the time periods of them. So you have Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, what used to be called Late Modern English, but now we just call Present Day English. Some just general time frames. I also think that it's important that you kind of see how English relates to some of the other languages. It's English family tree. So you can see it's part of the West Germanic languages. Those are the very early languages. And you see that Old English comes off of one branch, but we're also very much related to German, not too far away from Dutch, and then a more so like a socioeconomically higher German and High German, or then Yiddish. Again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm going to post these so that you can study them and you can have some idea of when things happen. But notice the things that I've emboldened are areas that where great change happened in the language. You will see that every time that this area gets conquered by different people, of course, the language changes a lot because it will fall under that new leadership. So you see that Celts inhabit much of Europe around 500 BC. But then by the time we get down to 55 BC, when the Romans raid and then they take rule of this area, then all of the formal language, all of the law, the schooling gets done in Latin. So Latin replaces the common languages that are occurring at this time. They still exist as in towns and villages and such as the home language of the people, but in order to conduct business, then one is expected. All of those documents are translated into Latin. So you have the Roman rule for quite a long time, but then you also see that at 450 AD, you see the beginning of the English period. So you see Anglo-Saxon settlements. So this is the Angles, the Frisians, the Saxons, and Jutes, and they're all like tribal people who live in and around what is now the UK. And this they each speak their own language, and yet they mix and they in battle and trade. And so you'll have things like pigeons. A pigeon is a language that is developed between two languages, primarily for trade. So they use a little bit of each other's language, and they develop a working relationship that they can communicate through that pigeon. If intermarriage occurs and settlements get developed from those two different tribes, let's say, or two different communities, and children are born, children will take that pigeon, and they will their natural language instinct will develop that language into a Creole first, and then which is sort of an intermediary language, and then a full language will develop out of that as generations go on. As we move through time, you can see that we start to get some historical evidence, some actual inscriptions of the language written down. You also start to see that we have remnants of hymns and poems. Again, we have conflict going on, and that changes the language. You'll see in around circa 800, the poem Beowulf is composed. If any of you are taking that period of literature or plan to take that period of literature to study, then these are our evidence. This is our primary evidence of English, and then we look at the changes throughout the remnants of literature, of religious documents, with law documents, whatever is existing. And 1066 is the Norman conquest. The Normans are the ancestors to the French. And so you see that early French language comes in. It becomes the ruling language as Latin once was, and it influences English greatly. That's primarily where we get those dual kinds of terminology. So we have pork and we have pig, we have veal, we have lamb and mutton. We have these influences from the French language, primarily due to the Norman conquest. As we go through time, we see that it's through these manuscripts that we are able to piece together the history of English, and we'll look at some of those in the next few slides. You'll see the university is first founded in 1167 with Oxford University. You have things like plagues. Interesting enough that in 1349-50, you have the Black Plague, kills a third of the population. These kind of natural events do change the language. We may see some language change after the virus passes. That new language will be used. New language or language will change. We'll use different terminology to refer to this period we're going through right now. So just as you could kind of trace changes in leadership, also changes the use of language. Notice in around 1450, we have the Great Vowel Shift begins. Language starts to change. The way that things are pronounced are changed, and eventually that change gets is systematic, and it goes through the population, and children that are born during this change will accept the new sounds. We're going through a change like that right now in the U.S., and we'll talk about that change as we get into more present-day changes and languages and dialects. But these things are visible and hearable. Now we have the beginning of early modern English around 1500. So again, things that really play a role in this are what texts are being recorded and who's recording those texts. So you have William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament, which varies different than the translations that were built on Latin translations of the Bible. So you also have the Common Book of Prayer. You start to see Shakespeare's works, which really captures a lot of the changes, and we're going to see that in a few minutes, where we can kind of trace the changes of English through what Shakespeare puts in his characters' monologues and dialogues. So then you have the first permanent settlement in the New World in the Americas, Jamestown. So the language that gets transported to the Americas is linked to whoever those settlers, and so we'll also trace those changes through the U.S. dialects this week as well. But here's just a few changes, and then now we get into the present day period. So again, really changes with colonialism and particularly with the settlement of the U.S. Noah Webster publishes the American Spelling Book, and he particularly makes a distinction between British spelling and British pronunciation with English. He wants the Americas to have their own version of English, and that's why we get some of those changes, like British color has the OUR and the American color only has the OR. Those are because primarily due to Noah Webster's determination that American English would be different from British. We also have that first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, the one that you used early on in the semester, as early as 1928. But this is there's still technological changes going on that are affecting our language use and changing our language. So this is just some history of that through the earliest of Englishes that we know. Just as an example about historic changes, English used to be a very different kind of language. It would add endings that designated a word as being masculine or neuter or feminine, like German does, if anyone has studied German. It also added different kinds of endings to make singular and plural, as well as not only just noun endings, but adjectives, adverbs, verbs would take on endings. This kind of system is called synthetic language. And so therefore, if you have an ending that designates the noun as the subject and this noun as the object, or that this adjective goes with this noun, then the word order is much more free than it is in the kind of English that we know. It's at this time that English changes. Function words arise, things like and, thus, of, prepositions, auxiliaries, those kind of words that function as grammatical parts of the sentence emerge, and we start to see a more reliance on word order. And as we know now that English is very much a subject-verb-object language, when languages rely on not endings that mark a word as to what it is or what it's doing in a sentence, then when we rely on word order, this is called an analytic language, and this is what we have now. And speculation is that because we had so much influence from the Celtic, Scandinavian, and other languages, that English changed and favored this form over the synthetic form. If you notice, this is one of the earliest remnants we have. You can, when I post the non-movie or non-narrated version of this PowerPoint, you can actually click that link up at the top and listen to how this sounds. But notice you can look at the words in order and the translation is under it, and you can kind of see some of the similarities that still remain in English. But you can also kind of see that there's endings, some of which we still keep. That looks like a plural S in the blue, but other endings refer to place or function, nor number, those kind of things that we no longer mark. So here's some more changes or some endings that those look fairly familiar. They probably are plural. Again, we have Beowulf that we have remnants as early as circa 800. And so again, there's a link up at the top if you want to listen to that. You can do so on the regular PowerPoint. But again, you can kind of see some similarities even in the modern translation. And then you can also see some differences. So we have, so shall young man good perform. So what's happened is that modal verb shall that you see at the beginning of the sentence is separated. It's part of the main verb form, shall perform, but it is separated from the other part of the verb by placing the lexical verb at the end of the sentence. This is very German-like. German has a V1 position and a V2 position that follows this form. And so you can see in early English, we did that as well. We could separate our verb form and place the lexical verb at the end. So now how would we describe this word order? We've got the verb, a part of the verb, the modal verb up front, shall, but we have it, and then we have a subject, and then we have the subject maybe, or we have an adverb that would describe perform, but now we have the main verb at the end, so we've got verb, subject, then we just have an adjective which doesn't play into the main word order, and then we have verb too. So a little different than what we have today. Again, in 10th century literature, that remnants that we still have. We have a form in which the verb here is placed first in the question, in the formation of a question. So hear you, advisor. So notice we can still, at this point, we rely on the form that the lexical verb can be in first position in question form. We saw that in standard English, we can't do that anymore. We have to have an auxiliary to place in front. And so in standard English, it would be, do you hear, advisor? But in early English, it was common that the lexical verb could be in first position in a question. So this is just a little bit of the differences that we see in Old English. We have a main verb and that can be divided from verb 1 and verb 2. You can have, there's some use of pronouns. They are used, but not probably used as much as we use them today. And we see the formation of question that often the lexical verb is fronted to make those questions. So the greatest differences between Old English and Middle English is word order. The loss of inflection in a lot of ways that show that a noun would be a subject or a noun would be functioning as the direct object, or that certain adjectives or adverbs go with certain other words. So there's a very low inventory of auxiliary verbs at this point. We start to develop them into Middle English, and then into Modern English is where the rise of the auxiliary really comes in. VPs could be omitted, so verbs could be omitted and just understood in context, so we wouldn't necessarily have to have a verb. We still see that in dialect where the copula could be omitted, like Pink says, if you a gangster, so she deletes the copula. That's still part of dialects in English, non-standard dialects, but it used to be part of standard English. You don't really see a lot of articles arise until Middle English, and then syntax kind of stabilizes between Middle English and Modern English. So if we look at this poem, William Langston's Piers Plowman, you can start to see, if you just read through that and try to read it aloud, there are many words that seem similar that you probably can understand. When we look at the translation, now you can see have more security in which words are reminiscent and linked to words that we still use today. And you can also see the ones that are very much different. And so this is something that some linguists do, that some linguists combine their linguistic training with their love for literature. Now here's Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, so we're all the way up to circa 1399. Again, if you want to listen to what this sounds like, you can click the link on the regular PowerPoint um, and notice. I don't know any if any of you have taken this period of literature in a class before, but when I was an undergraduate, part of this class of early English literature, we were required to memorize these lines right here. And we would have to go into the professor's office and recite those lines in Old English as part of our grade. So here is the modern translation. So if you want to hear what that sounds like, you can go to that link on the regular PowerPoint. But again, you can do sort of a syntactic analysis, a lexical analysis. We don't have enough training just from this class. We don't get into that enough to know about the pronunciation changes, but that would, if you're interested, the 407 linguistic analysis class would teach you how to do that if you wanted to really do an analysis of the sound changes that you see from 1399 to the present day. Oops. Why it's not advancing here. So I'll do it this way. Again, Shakespeare gives us a lot of evidence. We can, it's this, he's in this early modern period, and so a lot of his characters um, are in between. So he's hearing when he goes to the marketplace and he's listening to people talk, he can hear the old forms and he can hear the new forms that are rising. And he often puts within his characters, he will give them the old versions if they're older, or if they stand for tradition or a certain role in society, he will give them the old forms to speak. And then the younger characters or people who represent change or revolution or newness, he will give them the new forms to speak. So notice here we have in Romeo and Juliet an example of object, subject, verb. But then the sentence seems to stabilize to subject, verb, object, except that you now have a dual verb form. So you have aware and stole. So you have that separated there. But that's something we could do even today. So, but you do have that remnant of OSV at the beginning. And then in the second line, again, you have a verb form, but then really that is sort of a dependent clause, not quite the dependent clause we would create, but that's how it's functioning. So early walking. And then we have sort of a stabilization. We have, did I see your son? So we still have a verb, subject, verb where the verb to is separated, the see is separated from its auxiliary, but we kind of are seeing that subject, verb, object emerge there. And then again, here in the last line, we have many a morning hath he there been seen. So we have the modal separated from its lexical verb with the subject and object in between. So older forms in this play. In Richard II, we have an example um, of this lexical verb used fronted to make the question. Revolt our subjects. And in Henry III, we have, again, verb, subject, object to make a question with the lexical verb fronted. So very interesting analysis are done on Shakespeare's works to show these changes. Um, we also, Old English to Middle English don't have a lot of auxiliaries, but it's really in this early modern period that we see the rise of the auxiliary. And here we often talk about the rise of do or do insertion. So notice in the first column, we don't have the auxiliary do. We have or if it were it not belong to you. So we don't have an auxiliary in that sentence. In Hamlet, Bernardo says, "What think you on't?" Uh, in or Ophelia says, "What means your lordship?" And Rosalind, "Why look you so upon me?" So again, we have some lexical verb fronting. We don't have the do insertion, yet we also have do insertion in Shakespeare. So in Julius Caesar, all you did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him a knightly crown, which he did thrice refuse. So now we have particularly the use of do insertion with Anthony, um, someone who represents a change in the period of the play, but also as Shakespeare's audience is hearing this, they're hearing new language, they're hearing a new practice, and so it's very symbolic to the audience as well. Uh, we have in Hamlet, so we just saw in Hamlet people who used no do insertion, who were using the older form, but we also have in Hamlet examples of people using the new form. I do not doubt it, as you in Hamlet, or as you like it. Rosalind says, "What means this?" So no do insertion, but then she says, "Why do you look upon me?" So there are times that she does. She's kind of in that in between representation. So, from this little bit of history of English, if you're really interested, do take the class when it's offered. We want to get as many English majors interested in that period and those changes. It's really a fascinating class. But if you're interested, one thing that you could do for this class for your paper is if you like an Old English piece or a Middle English piece or even an early modern piece, something in Shakespeare or contemporary with Shakespeare, you can analyze the syntactic changes that are represented in an excerpt from that piece. So you pick a text, just correspond with me to establish a sufficient excerpt for the paper. The paper setup pretty much looks like this. You have your intro with thesis, obviously. You have a background section in which you kind of set up this piece, the specific literature, what is it, who wrote it, what's the time period, what's going on in that time period. Um, Maybe a synopsis, a paragraph that's a synopsis of the plot, not extensive, but just enough for people who are maybe less familiar or not recently acquainted with the work, to kind of catch up to speed onto what the poem is about or the play or whatever. And then you pick some excerpts from that work, just like we saw in the previous um, um, slides, and you analyze it. You analyze you describe what's going on there. And this is multi-paragraph, so you could do some with lexical, like the lexical choices that have changed. But because this class is more about English language, and particularly syntax, doing that syntactic change. What's the word order? Are there morphological affixes that signal certain things? And this is going to require a little bit of research. And then you'll have it, instead of a conclusion, I ask you to write a discussion. And so you kind of talk about, when did these linguistic changes stabilize? Did they develop further? Those kind of things. That's what I would rather have than a paragraph on what you just told me. I want you to take it to someplace else in the discussion. And then this paper, because it's both linguistics and literature, you could cite an MLA or APA. Just pick one. So that gives you some things to think about. There'll be lots of ideas that I'll present with you, but this is just one of them on a possible paper topic. All right, so I'm going to close out this one, and then I'll post it and start another PowerPoint for Tuesday as well.